guy goes, I'll take care of whatever. He never said anything. He just said, I'll take care of whatever's the problem. And I'm thinking that judge is one of the old ones that hang you. It's my kind of guy.
No. Been saying. My tile is pretty boring compared to Jeff's and Brad's.
You don't have to get with it.
I am, yeah, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, that's your job.
Yeah.
Get one of those ones that you push a button and it lights up and everything.
Squirts water or something.
Yeah.
I'd say that's for clowns, but I'll just stop. Still Romans chapter 1. Yeah, so last week we just started the series of lessons from Romans. So I get back to a book, studying through one book again. And so that's what we're doing. Talked about a little bit why Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. One was just to discuss kind of what his future plans were, that it was his plan to visit the church in Rome, which he had not done, and to prepare for his visit there, and then maybe use the church at Rome as his kind of maybe base to spread the word further west from there. So we talked about, we got the advantage of looking back. We know that Paul's plans didn't necessarily go the way he had hoped. He did make it to Rome, but he made it to Rome as a prisoner. And so we talked about, one of our plans. Sometimes our plans change. And so God didn't see fit necessarily to have Paul's plans go the way he wanted. So we should be careful of getting discouraged when we have to change our plans. So that's life. That's the way life goes. Talked a little bit about one of Paul's goals was to be able to preach more of the gospel there. We talked a little bit about what the gospel, just that idea of being that good message. And I won't write the Greek word back up there again this morning. And I just threw out the idea, I don't know if any of you have thought any more about it, is that when Paul wrote to the church at Rome, they didn't already have a letter to the Romans at that point. So we've had the fortune of having not only the book of Romans, but a lot of those letters. And many of us have been Christians for many, many years. So what is our motivation for studying a book that we've probably studied many times? What is it that we get out of going through a letter again? And how do we make those things apply? So not necessarily an answer. That's just an answer for you. It's an answer that I have asked myself. Why are we doing this again? Why do we come here every week and open up? What is it that we do? How do we use it? So again, that's a question for you. Chapter 1, we read. I want to read verses 18 through 23 again. That's kind of where we left off. There. I'll read it, and then I'll have some other folks read it.
What version are you in?
I usually read the New King James Version. So, but I like a lot of versions. I like the English Standard. I read the NIV. So don't think that's I'm making a statement because that's the one I read. There's one out. It's by Bible Hub. It's called the Berean Study Bible. It's an online, or I think you can make it. But I like to look at that one, just the way it reads sometimes. So there's Sometimes the different versions can be, I don't say a problem, but it's good to be able to look at different ones and say, oh, okay, well, maybe that reads a little clearer than what so, yeah, so don't think that's a statement by any means. Starting in verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Stop there. I think some versions, my version says Godhead, some talk about his divine nature, I think is how some read. Okay, so that may be a little more clear. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. So we talked last week about suppressing the example of suppressing the truth was trying to keep a beach ball submerged in a pool. Okay, that it takes effort. It's not something that's natural. The natural state of that, and it takes effort to hold it down. It takes it takes a conscience to hold that down underwater, and that's the idea of God's truth. That when we can't look at the things that are created, when we can't look at the things that are made and say, I can know that God is, and I can know something about God by those things, then we are making an effort to hold God's truth down. We are suppressing God's truth when we do that. And so what did that lead to? What is Paul saying that leads to? That lead to what kind of
exchanging the immortal for the mortal, or like the perfect for the imperfect.
Right. So basically making idols of some kind, right? In this case, probably talking about actual idols. Throughout Israel's history, throughout Judah's history, that was a problem for them, was seeing the nations around that were, and being caught up into that. And in some cases, of Israel actually setting up places of idol worship. And so that was a trap for them for many years, and sometimes to punish them for that. So, at the time that Paul wrote, the idea of the Greek religions or the Roman religions, maybe not necessarily idols, but a lot of their gods were created in an image of people. They gave those gods human traits, human failings, and then they were worshiping that. So, so even like I said, even when Paul wrote, that was something that he could see. And they weren't unique. The Egyptians, you look at, as Paul talked about, maybe wanting to preach further west into Spain. And if you get in Spain, up into some of the early Celtic religions, up into northern parts of Europe, just the worship of idols or the worship of human-like deities was common. And so Paul was just saying that when that happens, that's a result of people suppressing the truth, not recognizing God for who he is. And so we'll just go on. We'll read on here a little bit. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's interesting to know that this makes God angry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And at one point he talks about no excuse. Okay, I mean, there's no excuse. People have no excuse for doing that. And sometimes you can say, well, maybe I can see why, but God says there's just no excuse for it. So, and one thing I was going to mention is that, and I mentioned this last week, we didn't read verse 17 this morning, but last week, verse 17, it talks about the righteousness of God being revealed, and then right into the next verse, in verse 18, what is being revealed?
Wrath of God.
The wrath of God. And we talked about, the idea that the gospel is a good message. It's a message of salvation. Paul says it's the power of salvation, and then starts right in. The first part of his gospel is the wrath of God. So but there's a reason for that, and we'll get into that. Someone be willing to read Romans 1, verses 24 through 32.
I can read that.
Okay?
Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the Creator rather than the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameful acts with men, and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, and malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them.
Okay, so what can we learn about God, the nature of God, and our relationship to Him from these verses? Anything we can?
He allows sin to run.
Okay, that was one. Yep, that's exactly where I was going. He does not force us to acknowledge Him. Okay. He already told us that there's no excuse when we don't, but there's a couple phrases in here that give the idea, God does not force us to acknowledge Him now. He gives us the choice of whether we act according to what we should know about Him. Okay? But He says 3 times there that He's going to give us over or give us up. Okay? And that's just that idea that, again, He's not going to force us. If that's the path that you want to go down, we'll let you go down that path for now. Okay, so that's the idea. So again, he's probably still talking to, or generally referencing some of the worship of idols, or just how things were worshipped. And we said last week, where did we say that probably Paul wrote the letter to the Romans from?
Corinth area?
Probably Corinth. Yep, that's the kind of the consensus that that Paul was probably in Corinth for 3 months when he wrote. And what do we know about Corinth?
They had worse problems than the church at Rome.
Okay. There was a temple, I think it was in Corinth, to Aphrodite. Okay, and I can't remember the Greek. What's the Greek equivalent of Aphrodite?
Diana?
I don't remember. I think Diana was in Ephesus.
Yeah.
But anyway, some of the worship there involved temple prostitutes. And again, if you go back and look, through the Old Testament, that was not an uncommon practice among many nations, among many cultures at that point. Okay, so that was just something that was around. And again, Paul talking about those that would do such things were just, again, suppressing the truth. They were worshiping in a way, and God would give them up to that. He was not going to force people to worship Him, even though they have no excuse not to. So, So I think the first part of that, talking about worship, the next thing, worshiping idols, worshiping human-like deities, that kind of thing. Okay. And then we talk about, he gives over to, we mentioned a couple of sins there. What's the big one we always talk about here? Obviously, homosexuality. That's the big one, okay? And so that's the one that seems like we often end up talking about. That's the most kind of obvious. But so it talks about giving them up to vile passions, or how else does that describe that in verse 26? Gives them up to what?
Dishonorable passions.
Dishonorable passions, okay?
Things that are contrary to nature.
Okay, right. Okay. So again, so God giving them up, and obviously talking about things that were in their society, just like we have in our society today. Okay, so that's the big one that we often talk about. But then he goes on, talks about a whole list of other things there, and sometimes it seems like we overlook those things. You know, we spend so much time talking about the big one that we skip over, or we hurry over this long list of other things here. Okay. We ever think about strife, causing strife as a sin that God is going to give you up for? You know, I mean, that's just not one that it's not one of the first ones that come to mind when we read this passage. Since Elizabeth's here, do we ever think of disobedience to parents? That's one of the big things that God is going to give you up for.
Last time she comes to your class.
She can say she.
Yeah, like to look up like the gossip one too.
Yes.
It's very convenient to just.
In my past those things, yeah. But those are things, well, boasting. Hey, look what I did. You know, whether that's how we say it or not, you know, look what I've done. Unmerciful. Not being willing to give someone that forgiveness that we might feel like we need at times.
But if you're asking God for like envy,
Mhm.
or if you're asking God, can you take that away from me? Is that a sin that you have done it?
That you've asked for it? That you've asked for God to take it
If
away?
you ask him to take it away, is it a sin then? Because that's the grace part of it, isn't it?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was,
Yeah. No, there's nothing wrong with asking, you know, that's acknowledging a problem.
Okay.
And yeah, I don't,
that's where I'm,
Yeah.
I was like,
right. And does it talk about, and maybe it's later, or talks about those that practice such things?
Yeah.
So we all know we're going to do some of those things at some point. Okay. But I don't think that's what God is giving up or giving people over to. He's giving those that make that a practice in their life. Those that won't acknowledge that that's a problem.
Well,
Okay.
I was gonna say, it says they're filled with it, so it's like
Yes.
that's the only thing that's coming
Right.
out of
That's
their
their
soul.
motive. That's
Yeah.
their mode of operation or whatever. Okay. And so I just wanted to bring that out, that this so often it seemed like we talk about the big one there, you know, this homosexuality, but yet we skim over some of those other things.
You know, and I think just the fact that we view that as the big one, and, you know, we look at the rest of this list and maybe we think, well, these aren't a big deal. You know, I think that just reveals, well, maybe we've got a warped view, and, you know, there are some sins that maybe offend us more, and so we elevate them, but they all offend God, you know,
Right.
and all of them are bringing about that wrath of God.
Right. John?
So if you boast for your own glorification,
Mm-hmm.
is that where the sin lies?
I think so, yes. Yes.
I was looking at the root words on some of these words. They are way more inclusive of a broad range of sins than what the times of the scholars of King James time needed to assign something to each word.
Mhm.
But that word's actually way broader, like fornication in the King James.
Yeah.
That's actually pornea.
Mhm.
That's all the pornography
Yeah.
type stuff that enters men's lives.
Right.
So in each one of these words, if you look at the root, it's not just that word, it's everything associated with that
Right.
word.
Yes.
It's huge.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes not just an action, but the attitude that goes
The
before
whole
that.
attitude and everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, we often like to think, well, if it's not hurting someone else, it's not a problem. It's like, well, no, every sin is hurting God or
Mhm.
offending God.
Right.
Well, the historical time of the stuff that was going on
Mhm.
there when it comes to the homosexuality, we deem that as 18-year-old versus 18-year-old and above.
Mhm.
Well, that wasn't just the case
Yeah.
at this time.
Yeah.
It was 12-year-old.
Yes.
And
Yes.
10-year-old, you know.
Yes.
Um, So
And
that
in
was,
some cases, that was part of the temple worship.
and that was kings and
That was
people, I
part of
mean,
emperor worship.
you know, yeah, I mean, they just, that was, and so for me, he's highlighting that
Mhm.
because that was the most norm, I guess that's wrong to say, but that was prevalent throughout.
Yeah.
You know, this is a big deal here. This is prevalent. You guys are doing this all the time. This is what's going on.
Mhm.
And then mentions other things,
Right.
but that's a prevalent one.
Yes. Yes. But how do we know then that God may look at some of those other things if you practice those, maybe on par with that? Verse 32. Okay. What is different, deserving of those that practice those things? The death, yeah. Okay. So again, don't think that I'm not trying to soften one to another, but you know, all those things, that whole list of things are things that that God's wrath is going to be revealed against, or is being revealed against. And again, verse 32 says, you know, unless we're making an effort to suppress God's truth, we know that. That people should know that. So it's kind of scary. I guess it's a little bit scary. And so it makes us think, how am I thinking? What are my thoughts? So, any thought there?
You know, I've often kind of looked at this, and you know, there's try to figure out what the term is. You know, there's this path or this course that's outlined, because it all starts with the suppressing of the truth, you know, the thinking, and he talks about the thinking becomes futile, and then there's all these times where they change something or they exchange something.
Yeah.
You know, the glory of God, the truth of God, the natural relations, and you know, you can just see how, you know, there is this trajectory. That's the word I'm looking for, where, you know, when you start rejecting God and his truth, you know, you start going down this path, and, you know, maybe some people don't go down it as far as others, but every one of us can find something in that list that, you know, we have been guilty of.
Yeah. Great.
It's scary in verse 32 that basically we don't speak up or do something. Are we basically giving approval for it's okay?
Yeah. Yeah. So then the question is, how do we do that? You know, how do we speak up without?
Pushing away from
Yeah. So sometimes we just don't.
In other words, you don't go, great job.
Right.
You
Yes.
go, well, you know, we think we need to go another direction.
Yeah.
So is that what,
Yeah, well, I think so. Yeah.
okay, that's what I was like, okay, you know, the approval part of it.
Okay, so we talked about the Church at Rome was probably made up of Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, and some think that maybe that first part or that last part of is maybe talking a little more maybe to the Gentile Christians there, and then in verse 2, some think maybe he's switching a little more, talking about some of the Jewish those with Jewish background there. Someone be willing to read chapter 2, verses 1 through 11.
I can do it.
Okay.
Therefore, you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. Do you suppose, O man, you who judge those who practice such things, and yet do them yourself, that you will escape the judgment of God? Or do you presume on the riches of his kindness and forbearance and patience, not knowing that God's kindness is meant to lead you to repentance? But because of your hard and impenitent heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. He will render to each one according to his works. To those who by patience in well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, he will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, there will be wrath and fury. There will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. But glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek, for God shows no partiality.
Okay. So again, it seems like a harsh message still for what is supposed to be good news.
Yeah.
What's supposed to be a good message. If I were to mention Sister Bertha better than you, what am I talking about?
Sounds like envy.
Yeah, that's a Ray. It's from a Ray Stevens song, Mississippi Squirrel. Okay.
It went berserk, but I'll help you there.
Okay.
Just help you a little bit here.
No, it's the Ray Stevens song. I'm about the church getting loose in the church and going up to Sister Bertha's dress, and she starts, Sister Bertha better than you is how she was, and then
Shout hallelujah.
yeah, and then she starts naming some of the things that she's done. So I had an attitude of judgment, and then so that's just what I thought about. So again, Paul writing there is thinking, at least maybe to some of the Jewish, he may have been thinking that the first part of what Paul wrote in chapter 1 is, right on. That's right, And then Paul said, okay, you think you're something. Well, you do the same things. You judge others for doing those, but yet you can do, or you may do the same things. And that's an attitude. That's just a bad attitude. And so sometimes I think, actually Ben mentioned this in a sermon a couple of weeks ago, that sometimes we seem to be able to put our hope in knowledge versus our hope in God. And I think that's the attitude that Paul is talking about here. You think you're justified because of what you know. You think you're justified because I know that he did wrong or she did something that, not realizing or not acknowledging that you do the same thing. That you may have the same attitude. Okay, and so I think it's just a trap that we can fall into. I think Paul is saying here, God's judgment is not necessarily on a grading scale. You're not better off if you know you shouldn't do something and do it than you are if you don't know you're not supposed to do something and do it.
We naturally pick up other people's sins over ours, though. I mean, I think it's just, I hate to say natural, but don't you think that's the natural way? If I'm driving on a 4-lane and people in the left-hand lane is know, come on, get over it, you know, but I'm doing 79 and a 70
Yep.
because the Ohio State Police gives you 5, the Lord gives you 5, so I do that. And there's a guy doing 65 where you're like, come on, get over, what are you doing? What are you doing? And he finally gets over, but then there comes somebody behind me doing, what are you doing? Yeah, I'm fine, you know, and that's the way that I think with these, that we view sin. You know, it's easy to notice what somebody else is doing, but then when it comes on you, you know, you have a difficulty in being called out.
Yeah. And for those Jewish readers, when he mentioned the idolatry and the temple prostitute stuff and all that, they probably were feeling pretty good, you know, because it seemed at this point, at least in the Jews' history, the idols weren't as much of an issue.
Yes.
Of course, you go back a few years, they obviously were.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think sometimes we like to think too that it's the number of the things on this list that you check off that makes you worse. I'm like, well, no, if you're doing one of those things, you deserve death. Not if you're doing 5 or 6 of them, but just one of them is enough to warrant death. So we like to pass judgment when people are doing more sins that we view on this list. It's not
What was one of
at
the
all.
big arguments that Jesus often had with the Pharisees? But you're causing these people to sin. You're causing these people to have the wrong attitude. So that was, you know, Matthew chapter 7 verses 1 through 5. You know, Jesus tells us, excuse me, spitting on it. You know, Jesus tells us to be careful about judging the speck in another's eye. You know, when we have the beam sticking out of our own. Okay, and so often it's just we can be quick to judge others without fixing that problem because we do the same thing. Okay. I know, Paul, you mentioned about the speed. Mine is, if I'm driving, we all do it. I assume you hurry to pull out and you realize I pulled out right in front of somebody. And in your mind, you're saying, sorry, forgive me. But if someone does that to us,
That's awful.
We don't assume that that's what they're saying. We don't assume that they're asking, oh, sorry, forgive me. We're jawing at them all the way down, either out loud or, you know.
Probably not what they are.
And a lot of times, maybe not, but maybe they are. You know?
Which you mentioned about the Pharisees, made me think of, it talks about straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Like you're picking out these little tiny sins, but yet you're ignoring all these other big ones that should be more obvious.
Right.
Hey, Doug.
Yeah.
I think this Paul writing, in our Paul, the word is deflectors. Is you sit in a park eating your lunch and drinking a beer, and you see an old homeless guy that's got a bottle with him. You tell your kids, look at that drunk over there. And it's kind of that thing. That's not me, that's him. Because you can deflect your attention away from our own sin.
Yeah.
So you're deflectors, and
Right.
he's talking about judges here.
Yes.
Judges are deflectors.
Yep, exactly right. That's right. So what else does Jesus talk in Sermon on the Mount? So he talks about the merciful will be shown what? Mercy. Okay. And so we need to judge what's right and wrong. Okay. We have to judge what's right and wrong. You know, we can't not judge wrong action for being what it is. So often we judge a person as being less. We judge a person as being not worthy of God's mercy. And I think that goes to verse 4 in chapter 2. When you judge others, when you're not willing to show them any mercy, even though you're doing the same things, do you despise God's mercy that he has shown to you by not being willing to show mercy to someone else? Okay. Do you despise what God has done for you, the patience that he has had for you when you are overly judgmental, but when you're judging the worth of another person because you know better? Okay. So I think that's what maybe Paul is getting at there.
He's talking about these sins and these
Mhm.
things. But question, is he highlighting these sins as much as he's trying to say, you need to quit judging about these sins?
Without reading maybe the first 3 chapters, sometimes we can get lost a little bit in what the message is. And I was going to get to that, but the first part of the gospel talks about the power of the gospel is salvation. And salvation from what?
Yeah.
Well, to make people realize that you have to be saved from something, saved from God's wrath because of sin. You have to make people aware that there is sin. And I think that whole big section, clear up into the middle of chapter 3, is what Paul is talking about. Before I can talk to you about Jesus Christ being the Savior, I have to make you fully aware that
You're in trouble.
that you sin. Okay? And part of it is that everybody sins. And that's the whole message of, so we're chopping it up enough that that message shouldn't be lost. That Paul's message in the first 3 chapters of Romans is, in order for me to teach you the good news about Jesus, you have to realize that you need him for salvation from something. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, you need that message. And so that's the whole point of these 3 chapters. I'm getting through it slower than I'd kind of hoped, but that's okay, because I sure appreciate the comments and questions. Just one more thing there in that section. So verses 5 and 6. So Paul is kind of there doing something that we know to be true, and he's showing a progression there that sometimes we forget. There is a connection between what is in our heart and what our action is. And Paul, again, through the next couple of chapters, mentions what's in your heart more than once. He references that. But there is definitely a connection between what's in and what comes out. And he's, God is, of course, the good judge, because he knows what's in our heart. His judgment is true. His judgment is always on the same standard, and where ours is not. And God is not one that will judge others for doing the same thing that he does. Okay? So his judgment meets a standard that we can never have. And so I think maybe Paul, through that whole verses 1 through 12, was just saying, hey, folks, maybe you need to spend more time in self-reflection than in other reflection. Okay? Think about yourself. What's your attitude? What are your actions? And then you won't be so quick to judge others for doing the same thing that you're doing. Any other thoughts there on verses 1 through 11?
I just always like verse 4, where it's just making that point that the kindness of God is not there just to overlook sin, but to bring us to repentance of sin.
Right. And so it seems almost, I don't want to say contradictory, but you're talking about the wrath of God, and yet also it's God's nature to show us goodness, to show us patience, to show us, to wait on us. So, and that he wants us to come. Peter talks about how patient God is, that he doesn't want anyone to be lost, that he's patient, he's waiting. And, so again, that's an attitude, or that's in the nature of God also. Verses 12 through 16, we'll read that, and a couple things from that. And someone read those.
For as many have sinned without law will also perish without law, and as many have sinned in the law will be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of God, but the doers of the law will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, these, although not having the law, are a law to themselves. Yeah, explain all that one. Who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them. In the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel.
Okay, so again, still talking to Jews or Jewish Christians there that have an attitude of, because I have the law, because I know the law, and Paul's going to go deeper into this later, that I have a right to judge others. It's in my place, I can judge others because God gave me the law. But Paul is simply reminding God's going to judge everybody, Jews also, Jewish Christians also, and that he's more concerned about what you do than he is what you know. And I think that's just part of what he's saying there. So that would have been a tough thing for them to hear. So how can we apply that? That question I was going to ask next week. That's the next section. So I'll just do it. Anybody here have any Jewish ancestry? Recent Jewish ancestry? Okay. I think I was the only one that didn't. So the question is, how can we apply that? We don't pretend that we had the old law. We don't pretend. But so how can this apply to us? Can it apply in the fact that, like me, I was raised in the church. Okay? I've always gone to Bible study. My grandparents went. They went to Bible study. My great-great-grandfather helped build the church building that I grew up in. So it's easy. It would be easy for me maybe to have an attitude of, well, look at how I grew up. Look at the family I had. Look at what I've always known. So
one little bit, what is that? You know what I mean? If you like took that one little bit, and it might not even be a big one, it's just a little bit.
Right. So maybe that goes back into that boastful part, but I think we have to be careful of that attitude. Well, Brad's family didn't come in until, just a few years ago,
This is
So-
somebody like you will be inclusive when they show up to learn the truth with you.
Should be.
That's what it's for. The Gentiles had something in their heart that actually came from the foundation of creation that showed them they could be good people too, but they're still not Christians. And it's dependent upon somebody like you to include them.
What they've done in their life.
Or they couldn't be at my standards.
Yes.
Here's my standard, but you're down here.
Or they'll never catch up type thing.
Right.
Like there's
That's
no
exactly-
amount of time that will get them to my level.
Is that clear enough? So that's tough. It is tough. I think sometimes, we don't have that necessarily that Jewish background or that, so we have to think about how does that apply to me? How can what is Paul saying to them? How is that something that I can incorporate in my life so that I'm not judging others untruthfully, or I'm not overly judging for what I think they don't know or what they didn't have in their life. So, any other thoughts there? Okay, I think we'll stop there. Paul will continue kind of the same thought in the rest of chapter 2 we'll look at next week. Thank you for the comments and questions.